with me, 'cause you know that I'm a loser. I'm proud of that fact that you know I had to feel like a woman. That's the plan.
There was a moment in the studio when the sound didn't stop. The tape was still rolling. The lights were still on. The room was waiting. But Maurice Gibb wasn't speaking anymore. No argument, no outburst, just silence. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that settles in quietly and then refuses to leave. No one stopped the session. No one asked what was wrong. They all felt it, and somehow that made it heavier. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. Maurice had always been the one who filled the space, not just with music, with words, with humor, with a kind of restless energy that made rooms feel less tense, even when they were. He talked when things got awkward. He joked when others grew quiet. He played mediator when emotions threatened to spill over. That was his role. Unofficial, unspoken, but constant. So when he stopped talking, it wasn't dramatic, it was unsettling. The studio had seen plenty of difficult moments before. Disagreements, creative dead ends, long nights where exhaustion blurred into frustration. Silence wasn't unusual. But this was different. This wasn't a pause while thinking. This wasn't concentration. This was absence. Maurice sat there, hands still, eyes lowered but not focused, as if something had been said or heard that couldn't be answered. No one would describe it that way at the time. They wouldn't have had the words. They just knew something had shifted. And whatever it wasn't leaving with the end of the session. For most of his life, Maurice had been surrounded by sound. Music first, always. Harmony woven so tightly with his brothers that it was hard to tell where one voice ended and another began. The Bee Gees weren't just a band. They were a shared nervous system. Every change in mood rippled outward. Every silence was noticed. Maurice knew that better than anyone. He was the one who listened, hardest. Not always the loudest voice, not always the center, but the one who noticed when something was off, which made that studio moment harder to understand. Because this time, he was the one who went quiet. At first it was subtle, a shorter response, a missed joke, a nod instead of a comment. The others didn't push. They were used to giving each other space. Besides, there was work to do. There was always work to do. But as the hours passed, it became harder to ignore. Maurice wasn't disengaged. He wasn't angry. He was present without being present, as if his body was in the room, but his thoughts had slipped somewhere else entirely. Later, people would try to explain it. They'd point to exhaustion, pressure, the weight of expectation that followed them everywhere. And those explanations weren't wrong. They just weren't complete, because something else had happened. Something small, maybe. Something that didn't sound important on the surface. But it landed in a place Maurice rarely let anyone see. The place where he kept the things he couldn't fix. Maurice had always been the stabilizer. When tensions rose between his brothers, he softened them. When success became overwhelming, he downplayed it. When failure hit, he absorbed it quietly. He was good at holding things together. Too good. So good, in fact, that people sometimes forgot he was holding anything at all. That was part of the problem. In the studio that day, the music wasn't wrong. The notes worked. The harmonies locked in the way they always did. On paper, everything sounded fine, but Maurice couldn't bring himself to speak into it. Couldn't comment. Couldn't adjust. Couldn't joke his way through the discomfort. Because the silence wasn't about the song. It was about something the song had stirred up, something older, something unfinished, and once it surfaced, it didn't ask permission. No one confronted him, no one needed to. Sometimes the absence of words says more than any argument ever could. Maurice didn't announce what he was feeling. He didn't frame it as a crisis. he just stopped contributing. And for a band built on harmony, that was louder than any disagreement. Years later, people would remember that session differently. Some wouldn't remember it at all. Others would recall a vague heaviness, a sense that the room had grown smaller. But Maurice remembered, not the technical details, not the takes or the mixes. He remembered the feeling, the moment he realized he didn't know how to explain what was happening inside him, and more importantly, that he wasn't sure anyone really wanted to hear it, because the Bee Gees had always been about forward motion. Another song, another album, another performance. There wasn't much room for stillness, especially not the kind that asks uncomfortable questions. Maurice had spent years smoothing over the rough edges, but that day in the studio, he felt one catch, just one, and it stopped him cold. He didn't walk out. He didn't make a scene. He stayed, silent, and that choice, to stay without speaking, would linger longer than anyone realized. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Silence, once it enters a room like that, has a way of changing how everything sounds afterward. Even when Maurice eventually spoke again, because of course he did, something had shifted. The words returned, the jokes followed. But they didn't land the same way. Those closest to him sensed it first, not as a crisis, more like a hairline fracture, small enough to ignore, large enough to spread. Maurice had always been good at hiding strain behind humor. It was one of his most reliable tools. But now the humor arrived a second too late, or left a second too early. He laughed, and then went quiet again. No one challenged it. By that point, silence had become familiar. The Bee Gees were no strangers to internal pressure. Their history was full of cycles, success, backlash, reinvention. They had survived worse than awkward studio sessions. And yet, something about Maurice's quietness felt different. It wasn't creative disagreement. It wasn't exhaustion alone. It was personal. But personal in a way that didn't announce itself. Maurice didn't withdraw completely. He showed up, he played, he sang when needed. But he stopped volunteering parts of himself, stopped filling the gaps. And in a band built on shared instinct, that absence created new gaps no one knew how to fill. There were moments when he would start to speak, then stop, as if realizing mid-thought that the words wouldn't land the way he needed them to, as if explaining would require admitting something he wasn't ready to name. At the time, the explanation seemed simple. Maurice was the middle brother, not the front man, not the dominant songwriter, essential but often understated. He knew his value, but he also knew how easily it could be overlooked. That tension had existed for years. What changed was how much it started to weigh on him, because that studio moment hadn't just silenced him in the room. It had followed him home. Friends noticed it in conversations that drifted without resolution, in pauses that lasted too long. Maurice would listen intently, then respond with something lighter than the moment deserved, as if steering the conversation away from deeper ground. The thing was, he wasn't avoiding others. He was avoiding a realization, one that had been building quietly for years. Maurice had always been the emotional anchor, the one who absorbed instability so others didn't have to. But anchors don't float. They sink slowly, carrying weight no one sees. And that studio silence marked the moment he felt the full pull of it. Still, nothing outwardly changed. There was no announcement, no intervention. Life continued in the only way it knew how. Sessions resumed, schedules filled. But Maurice's relationship with the music subtly shifted. He approached songs more cautiously, listened longer before contributing, and sometimes chose not to. That restraint was new and unsettling, because Maurice had always believed that music was where things got resolved, where emotions could be translated safely. But now even music felt like it was asking questions he didn't want to answer. There were nights he stayed behind after sessions ended, not working, just sitting, letting the room empty, as if hoping the quiet would finally explain itself. It never did. Instead, it deepened. The brothers didn't confront him about it. They assumed he'd speak when ready. They trusted that rhythm. They always had. What they didn't realize was that Maurice wasn't deciding when to speak. He was deciding whether he could, because the truth that had surfaced in that studio moment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was something far more difficult to articulate, a feeling that had no clear villain, no single moment to point to, just a slow accumulation of being needed, without being asked, of being essential, without being seen. And admitting that would have required disrupting the balance he had spent his life protecting. So he stayed quiet, not out of resentment, out of loyalty. Years later, people would try to connect dots. They'd point to habits, to stress, to the wear of decades in the public eye. And again, those explanations weren't wrong. But they missed the moment when something changed internally. The moment Maurice realized that silence was easier than explanation, that not speaking protected everyone else, at a cost only he was paying. And that cost was growing. By the time he noticed it, the weight felt permanent, unmovable. The studio moment didn't break him, but it cracked something open, something that would continue to widen quietly, session by session, song by song. And the closer he got to naming it, the harder it became to speak at all. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It never does. For Maurice, it surfaced in fragments, in moments when the studio felt unfamiliar, in songs that sounded right but felt wrong, in harmonies that still worked yet no longer comforted him. He had spent most of his life understanding other people's emotions before they fully understood them themselves. That skill had made him indispensable. It had also made him invisible. The studio moment wasn't about being interrupted or ignored in a single conversation. It was the quiet realization that his role had slowly narrowed without anyone noticing, not because they didn't care, but because he never asked them to see him differently. Maurice had learned early that keeping peace meant absorbing tension, so he did, again and again. Until one day, sitting in that familiar room, surrounded by familiar faces, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to think before. He didn't know where his voice ended. And the role began. And for the first time, that frightened him. That was why he stopped talking, not out of anger, not out of protest, out of uncertainty. Because speaking would have meant admitting that the balance he'd protected for decades had come at a personal cost. It would have meant saying, quietly but honestly, "I don't know where I fit anymore." And that felt more destabilizing than silence. So he chose the quieter option. He stayed present. He stayed supportive. But he pulled inward. The others sensed it, but couldn't name it. They loved him. They relied on him. They just didn't realize how much he had been carrying. Maurice never framed it as pain. He wouldn't have used that word. He saw it as responsibility. But responsibility, carried too long without release, becomes something heavier. Over time, the studio no longer felt like a place of refuge. It felt like a mirror. And Maurice had begun to avoid looking too closely. When he later spoke about those years, fair, carefully, without drama, he didn't describe a breakdown. He described a gradual quieting, a sense of stepping back, of listening more than speaking, of letting things move forward without his input, even when he had something to say. That studio moment marked the first time he consciously chose silence, not because he had nothing to contribute, but because he didn't know how to contribute honestly without unsettling the world he helped hold together. That choice followed him, not loudly, gently, in the way he deferred, in the way he softened his presence, in the way he let others take the lead without resistance. From the outside, it looked like ease. From the inside, it felt like disappearance. And yet, there was no bitterness in it, just sadness. the kind that doesn't ask to be fixed, only acknowledged. Near the end, Maurice didn't talk much about that studio moment. He didn't need to. It lived in the pauses, in the spaces between sentences, in the way he listened, with more intensity than he spoke. Those who really paid attention understood something important. Maurice hadn't gone silent because he was unheard. He went silent because he had spent a lifetime being the one who heard everyone else. And for a brief moment in that studio, the weight of that truth finally surfaced. He stopped talking, not to punish, not to withdraw love, but because silence was the only honest response he had left. In the end, that moment wasn't a fracture. It was a signal, a quiet acknowledgement of a life lived in service to harmony, musical and emotional, often at the expense of his own voice. And when the room finally filled with sound again, the silence remained, not as absence, but as understanding. The kind that only arrives when the music fades, and what's left is the person behind it.